Thank you so much for attending this webinar. Apologize for the switcheroo on the links. We weren't able to get the Zoom webinar software to work for us, but we're going to do it under regular Zoom. The positive of that, it means that you can heckle me along the way, although I'm hoping you save your heckling to the very end. So this presentation is about some recent research that we've been working here at the Meadows Center on, we're calling correlative allocations or correlative rights. And I didn't choose this title. I think staff here did, and it's a good one. Can correlative allocations save Texas groundwater? And I think you can interpret save in two different ways, like can it, save or conserve Texas groundwater, but also in the other way of saving Texas groundwater. I want to acknowledge deep appreciation for the Hershey Foundation, who funded this research, and thanks to Elizabeth Love, who's the head of the Hershey Foundation, CEO, and then Andy Sampson, who's one of the board members, and also has an interest in correlative rights and correlative allocations. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment, we are a research institute at Texas State University. We serve as an education facility, so we have greater than 140,000 guests come through here a year, learning about the springs, endangered species, the environment. We employ about 120 students over the course of a year, graduate students, undergraduate students, giving them some real life experience, both in research and being environmental interpreters. Gifts, grants, and graces provide 93% of funding. We're, of course, grateful for the endowments from the Meadows Foundation to get us set up. We're very grateful for the support from the university, but just want to remind folks that, if we don't have funding coming in, then, it's hard for us to keep going. And then also we're stewards of the headwaters of the San Marcos River. And in fact, if I look out my window that way, I see a glass bottom boat turning around on Spring Lake. And so we have staff that's actively working to maintain habitat in the lake and down through the river, as well as volunteers. So thanks to the folks that do that. This presentation is related to a report that came out in February. The image is here. I put a link to the list of reports at the Meadows Center's webpage, so you can download a PDF of it if you would like. I also want to acknowledge my co-author, Yipeng Zhang. He is currently with the Boone Pickens School of Geology at Oklahoma State University. He was primarily with us at the Meadows Center at the time, and he's gone off to do bigger and better things up in Oklahoma, and glad to have him as a collaborator, and we continue to collaborate to this day. It's also the cover choice here. You're looking at a part of the high plains of Texas with these irrigation pivot systems or circles that you see, which is, by my eyes, a pretty beautiful image. That's all groundwater being pumped from the Ogallala aquifer. And you can also see by the spatial distribution of these circles that there's like almost an inherent correlative use of the aquifer. In other words, wherever a landowner or a farmer has irrigable land above the aquifer, where the aquifer can be produced, they're producing that water. So it's almost like a de facto correlative allocation of water resources. Little disclaimer, groundwater management in Texas is always evolving. So this is a study kind of fusing science with quite a bit of policy. And so a lot of the stuff I'm going to share with you came from reading through groundwater management plans in Texas, thankfully not all of the management plans. And we looked at everyone, but we were specifically looking for things related to correlative rights and correlative management. But groundwater management in Texas is always evolving. So, and in fact, I know for some rules have changed since we completed this survey in 2024. So apologies if your district gets mentioned here and it's changed. And also apologies if we've misinterpreted your rules in some way, shape, or form. So outline, first want to answer the question, why do this study? Follow that up with what is a correlative right / a correlative allocation? Talk to you all about what we found on correlative allocations in Texas. Then talk about coupled and uncoupled correlative allocations, what those are and what those look like in the state. And then some challenges and opportunities. I emphasize some just because it's, I think, difficult in this presentation to provide a complete overview of that stuff. But we'll, on both sides, what are some of the challenges of doing a correlative allocation approach versus some opportunities? And to a certain degree, it just kind of depends on a district's situation going forward. So on the why part, those of you that are from Texas, you know that we are a thirsty state. Part of that is due to drought, and part of that's due to our massive population growth. We're expected to grow 75% in population over the next 50 years. And this is a map from the 2022 State Water Plan showing where municipal water needs are the greatest across the state. Not surprisingly, municipal water needs are associated with municipalities. So you see Dallas-Fort Worth, you're seeing Lubbock, El Paso, Houston, the lower Rio Grande Valley, as well as the Austin and San Antonio I-35 growth corridor. And the easy water, local easy water for these communities is gone. So they're having to look elsewhere for water. Surface water is a common source, but also groundwater is also looked to as a source of water. So this is a stressor in the system. Then there's the EAA, or Edwards Aquifer Authority, versus Day and McDaniel case that the Texas Supreme Court decided a number of years ago that made it clear that groundwater districts could be subject to regulatory takings lawsuits if they denied people the right to use the water underneath their land, the groundwater underneath the land. And then the court also invoked, for the first time, the concept of fair share, which is a concept borrowed from oil and gas law. Basically, the court saying that one of the roles of groundwater management is ensuring everybody gets a fair share of the water underneath their property. The Day and McDaniel case is part of the why for doing this study, because it's really causing challenges for districts to manage the groundwater resource in a way that doesn't get them sued or having to pay large amounts of money in regulatory takings. So that's on one side, and then the other side is this whole concept of fair share, that this may be the filter that the Texas Supreme Court looks at future challenges into what districts can and can't do. And so, what does that, what exactly does that mean on the groundwater side of things? So the law case law is still yet to be written here. Some would argue with me it's quite clear in there, but it hasn't been a case to say, hey, this is exactly what it needs to be. And then also, when I hear fair share, I think about correlative rights, in terms of everybody getting a right to use the groundwater underneath their property. All of these things kind of lead into a challenge for groundwater districts to achieve desired future conditions. So if you're not familiar, desired future conditions are management goals that groundwater districts have within the 16 groundwater management areas across the state in terms of like what they want their aquifers to look like in the future. Do they want to preserve spring flow? Do they want to minimize or keep water level declines below a certain level? Are common desired future conditions, many of them related to water level declines in the aquifer. You're going to see a bunch of chat GPT generated content here. I asked it to create a slide on streetcar named desired future conditions, and this is what the robot overlords gave me, which is actually pretty cool because it's like got a recharge zone, aquifer deplete. I didn't tell it to do that. Sustainable yield, I didn't tell it to put it in there. It did that. If you look carefully at the rails, you can kind of see that that streetcar is a little off the rails. Not sure if that means anything or not, if there's something there, but and then it looks like there's a lot of attorneys in there. It might be Janet Guthrie on that streetcar. I don't know, but anyways, and then there's also another Chat GPT generated image that you know, the foundational law for Texas is rule of capture, and of course, groundwater districts theoretically supersede the rule of capture. Rule of capture meaning you can pump as much as you want, regardless of the damage it causes to your neighbors, as long as you're not wasting water, as long as you're not causing damaging land subsidence. But because of Day and McDaniel, and I think the challenge is one general observation, not every district, so doesn't apply to every district. One general observation is that, you know, districts that are under the pressure of increasing use, particularly those donut districts around the urban areas, they wind up, you know, seeking not to get sued or get challenged. Maybe they honestly believe that you know, everybody does have a right to, you know, groundwater underneath their property, which people do, but even more, they just wind up changing the desired future condition to prevent conflict. And so, but at the end of the day, you know, my question is, well, what is your desired future condition? You know, thinking back to the intent of that law, it was for districts to say, hey, this is truly how we want our aquifers to look like in the future. But if the goalposts keep moving, then it kind of looks like rule of capture with speed bumps, and hence this image here. And then, you know, sometimes I also like to play a little game where I'm like, if I was a groundwater management or groundwater manager in a groundwater conservation district in Texas, how would I do things? And so this is the Gary Westbrook superhero thing. So there's Gary, and he's holding the Bible, because if you know, he's a part reverend. He's got the water code there. There's the required plate of barbecue. There's an attorney there down to the left. And then there's an unusually attractive Steve Young, a groundwater modeler, in the lower right-hand corner. And then some water level measuring tape there. But I often ask my question, kind of what if games, like, well, if I was a groundwater district manager and I had a board that listened to what I told them, how would I manage groundwater resources, giving all these things I just talked about? And I do gravitate to a correlative rights type approach. So I have a personal interest in this as well. Okay, so what is a correlative right? And the correlative right is basically a right to use groundwater correlated to a generally land surface acreage. There are a number of states across the country that use correlative rights as a way of managing groundwater. So instead of rule of capture, for example, you would have a correlative right. And then there's still some policy decisions to be made in terms of like, what do you want your aquifers to look like in the future when you think about correlative rights? But a lot of times, if not most of the times, it's simply a right expressed in, you know, how much can you pump per acre of land, you know, from the aquifer, if that aquifer exists beneath your land. So again, correlative right is just the right to use water correlated to generally to surface acreage. Correlative rights also get lumped in and sometimes in some states used interchangeably with the reasonable use doctrine. So reasonable use doctrine developed as an alternative to the rule of capture doctrine um, up in the American Northeast, that basically said that you couldn't pump as much as you want, but you could pump a reasonable amount, based on your property and also based on what your neighbors were doing. And somebody decided that correlative right, which kind of makes sense, if your ability to use the groundwater resource is tied to acreage, then that by definition would be and could be reasonable. The groundwater class I teach, I treat these separately because reasonable use doctrine, at least the vanilla reasonable use doctrine, also recognizes a connection between surface water and groundwater, where with correlative rights, that is not required. Correlative rights is just simply how much you can pump based on your surface acreage. There may be some other factors in there as well. When I got into the study, working with Peng, I'd been talking about correlative rights, and I realized that correlative rights is probably too strong a word for Texas, and generalized it to correlative allocations. And we'll talk a bit more about why I make this distinction. A right is a right, and some of these allocations, I think probably legally are not actually rights, particularly because they can be dependent on a number of different factors that can change over time. So how much of a right is a right if it's changing on a number of things. So you'll hear me talking about correlative allocations. I might slip and say correlative rights, unless I explicitly say otherwise. Assume I'm talking about correlative allocations. Okay, so let's jump to correlative allocations in Texas. Since I love the history of things, I spent a little bit of time on trying to figure out who was the first one that did correlative allocations. And I knew that there was a number of districts that have a correlative allocation, for example, 2 acre-foot per acre per year. That is a correlative allocation, and there's a number of districts that have that, particularly out in the Ogallala. And I kind of thought that, well, maybe that was there from the get-go, and was surprised to see, for example, the High Plains Groundwater Conservation District, was starting to talk about it in 1976. And they established the problem as the drilling and producing of large capacity water wells on small tracts of land, primarily associated with municipalities or communities. And generally a community isn't going to buy a giant ranch. It happens though, but generally not going to buy a giant ranch to put their well on. Their well is on a small piece of property where the water tank is. And you've probably seen some of these driving around town. Out in the Ogallala is that map I showed you with all those crop circles. Everybody's using the water. Farmers have acreage associated with their use, and then somebody can come along and have a small piece of land and pump a lot of water. So High Plains identified this as an issue in 76. And then in 77, though, it was the Panhandle Groundwater Conservation District that passed a rule to limit production based on acreage to address the same issue. And if Boone Pickens was around, he'd be like, those were the good old days, because those 10 acre feet per year per acre was the original allocation in the Panhandle Groundwater Conservation District. I'm not saying Panhandle was the first one to do this in Texas. I was, paid to go do other research, not look at the history of this, so somebody could go in and look a little bit more closely to tell a fuller story. But this appears to me like maybe where it started, and then it got into the rules, and then as districts started to proliferate, there's some policy inertia there where, one district takes the next district's rules and then modifies it. It's kind of how I think those things move forward. So here's another Chat GPT image. I was like, show me an image of groundwater management plans strewn across the floor. And so you see one of them, groundwater management plan, but also threw in on its own aquifer recharge strategies, sustainable yield analysis assessment, two sustainable yield assessments, evaporation, water conservation, and then it has lots more of springs up there. And which is a little creepy, because I am doing some work on Lost Morris Springs. So how did it know that? So we went through all of the groundwater management plans in the state, looking to see if there was any correlation, correlative allocations that the district did. And we found that about 60% of the 98 groundwater districts correlate groundwater production to surface acreage. I have maximum there. There's a couple that actually use it to define a minimum. I'll show you one example in a little bit. This is actually lower than I would have guessed going in, considering how prevalent it seems to me that districts do have like a, 1 acre foot per year per acre type rule, but still a sizable number of districts doing this. I think that it works out to 59 groundwater districts. The correlative allocations range from 0.04 acre feet per acre per year to more than 90 acre feet per acre per year. And again, these are groundwater management plans as they existed last year. The median correlation was 1.5 acre feet per acre per year, which is what I would have guessed going in. 25% were less than half an acre foot per acre per year. 25% were greater than 3 acre feet per acre per year. And then 10% of the allocations are greater than 8 acre feet per year per acre, which is a lot of water on a per acre basis. I throw up Brazos Valley and Rusk County. They were interesting because they use an equation. They have since changed their rules on this. They still have this equation-based thing, but let me put a big asterisk on it. The exact numbers here or this graph may not apply. But they have this equation here. And so I worked out the equation. We have, and it's a logarithmic plot. So be aware, where the effective correlation allocation acre feet per acre per year on the vertical axis, topping out at just under 200 acre feet per acre per year. And then contiguous acres. So what your allocation is depends on the number of acres that you have with this, which is how, I kind of solve that equation there with 1 acre to come up with a 1 acre number. I'll concede that in this case, as well as all these other districts cases, oftentimes the correlative allocations they use are like maximum amounts, and then there may be an overlay of other district rules that apply that may lower that number as required by the rules below that kind of maximum correlative allocation amount. So, but even with 1,000 acre ranch, you could do 8 acre feet per acre per year, back with these rules at the time that we looked at them. I'm going to name some districts. I'm not picking on a district, not judging, I'm just kind of like, it's like, oh, this is interesting. They used an equation, we have to math our way out of this to figure it out. And then it's also kind of interesting to look at what the result or potential result of these numbers could be. A brief but beautiful aside about cumulative distribution functions. I love cumulative distribution functions, so I'm going to show a few. A cumulative distribution function is basically a plot of kind of the statistical distribution, like a bell curve, but the probabilities are cumulative. And so it winds up going from 0, you see down here in the lower left, up to 100% up at the upper top. We've got a linear scale vertically, and we've got a log scale horizontal showing correlative allocation. And then this is percent less than. So the median value is, here's that 1.5 I mentioned. So this is showing the correlative allocations for all 59 groundwater conservation districts that we found them at. You can see it goes up as high as approaching 400, and then also down really low. And the fact that this looks like a kind of a sigmoid type curve suggests this approximates a normal distribution. And then these are also useful, like all the data is posted here. So this 80% of the values are less than 3 acre-feet per acre per year. And then there's 20% above here, so 20% are greater than 3. So just allows you to look at some of the statistics. Okay, so considerations for correlation. So as we went through the rules of the districts, we noted what, how the districts employed correlative allocations. And these are in no particular order here, but like one district, depending on the crop you're growing, you had a different correlative allocation per acre. If you grew corn, you got a bigger one. If you grew cotton, you got a lower one, which is probably more about encouraging conservation more than anything. There's escape clauses. In other words, if a district set a correlative correlation, it allowed certain types of users of water or permittees to escape those restrictions, under special circumstances. Some of them are time-based, which is interesting. So it might be one correlative correlation applied up to a certain point, and then after that point, a different correlative correlation. So for example, not a real example, but just for example, before 1985, you could do 3 acre-foot per acre per year. After 1985, you could do 1.5 acre-foot per acre per year, if you came in for a permit after 1985. There was also a distinguishment between historic use versus new use. So sometimes historic use had its own correlative allocation that a district used. And then if you were a new user coming in, you then used a different correlative allocation. Some of them had different correlative allocations for retail public water utilities, as a way to deal with the issue between farmers having a lot of acreage and needing water versus public water utility not needing all that acreage for what it needed, at least under the district's rules. There were some districts where they had a correlative allocation, but it didn't apply to public water supply wells. There was one that set correlative allocations based on well depth and water quality. And then we've got one district, which we'll hear more about, and I will name, that used net sand thickness to help guide its correlations. So I just point that out because this is a way for, I guess, just to show y'all that districts kind of in this marketplace of management ideas that we have in groundwater management in Texas have used a number of creative ways to deal with their local issues or unique circumstances. And these are things that could also be used by others, I suppose, as they go forward. So let's talk about coupled and uncoupled correlative allocations. So as we went through another chat GPT, this is awesome. It's just like, give me a couple, one angry facing away from each other, and then a couple holding each other happy. And it was awesome as it gave me the same couple. So it's kind of creepy. It's like almost like two twins dating each other or something. But anyways, so what I mean by coupled and uncoupled is that you have correlative allocations, but how do they relate to the desired future condition? So the desired future condition, to remind you all, is the district's goal. That results in something called a modeled available groundwater number, which is an estimate of how much can be pumped to achieve that desired future condition. And so what we called a coupled correlative allocation was when the allocation or correlative allocation was coupled to achieve the desired future condition versus uncoupled correlative allocations where that correlative allocation had nothing to do really with achieving the desired future condition. And looking at the 59 districts that used correlative allocations, I'm having to force myself not to say rights there. Vast majority of them are uncoupled. In other words, they have correlative allocations in their rules, but those allocations have nothing to do with achieving the desired future condition, or they don't relate directly to achieving the desired future condition. But 5 districts do. So I'm not going to talk about all 5 districts, but I'm going to talk about a few of them as some examples of how that works. So here's the Guadalupe County Groundwater Conservation District. I should note I tried to make a action figure of Kelly Cochran, and the chat GPT just would not let me do it. It's like, it's like, we won't let you do this for a real person that works for a real groundwater conservation district. And I'm just like, you let me do one for Gary Westbrook with no problems whatever. So I don't, maybe Gary Westbrook doesn't really exist. I don't know. Anyways, so the Guadalupe County Groundwater Conservation District does have a correlative allocation tied directly to their desired future condition. And then furthermore, they not only consider surface acreage over the aquifer, but they also factor in how much sand is underneath a piece of property when they then allocate their modeled available groundwater across the district. In many ways, this is a correlative right. It's an allocation, but it is a correlative right because your right to pump is tied directly to this number that you get from the district. It's also neat that the district has, it's adaptive in the sense that as the science gets refined on where the sands are, it will make adjustments on these allocations. So here's another cumulative distribution function showing how the correlative allocations are distributed in Guadalupe County for the Carrizo part of the Carrizo-Wilcox aquifer. So you can kind of see there's like a little double hump here. So there's a bimodal distribution here. There's kind of 2 peaks, one for the smaller pieces of property that don't have as much sand compared to the larger, where there's not as much sand, I'm sorry, versus where there's a lot more sand. And so 50, the median is like, 0.18 acre feet per acre per year. And with the big, the highest one being a little over 0.8 acre feet per acre per year. So this is, I would call probably the purest application of correlative rights in the state is what Guadalupe County is doing. Brewster County also has an interesting approach. And yes, they have an equation. It's always fun to see equation in groundwater districts rules. So they have a water allocation factor, which is pretty much your correlative allocation, acre feet per year per acre. They have the MAG minus existing use, not permitted use, but how much of the permitted use is being used. They include exempt and non-exempt use here. They have future use, which is like the expected growth of the current permit holders going forward, as well as the growth of exempt use. And then divided by the land that's left. And so that gives them a water allocation factor. So if you show up to Brewster County and you want to come in for a groundwater permit, they will employ this equation, and they'll see how many acres you have, and they'll be like, this is what you're eligible to get. And then if you need to get more, you go acquire more acres or maybe lease more acres. It comes some agreements in order to achieve the amount of water you need to achieve. So what I don't understand is like there's, I don't know if there's some historic use that's kind of included in here. You know, exactly how this existing use and these existing permits fit in. So it may not be a pure correlative right type approach, but this is a way they've employed kind of correlative allocations directly to achieving the desired future condition with the modeled available groundwater. Coastal Bend Groundwater Conservation District kind of has a flip on this. So they have something called minimum mag-derived amount that authorized production will never fall below. So, so they're taking the modeled available groundwater number and dividing it by the total acreage in the district to come up with this minimum mag-derived amount. And they're saying that guaranteed your authorized production will never fall below that. And kind of infers that maybe that this is a way to try and achieve the desired future condition, but it is a little vague and a little unclear. The Corpus Christi Aquifer Storage and Recovery Conservation District defines a correlative allocation based on fresh and groundwater flow into their aquifer in their district, and then divide it by the acreage in the district. And so they have a correlative allocation of 0.04 acre feet per acre per year. And then there's Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation District. And I don't know if Gary's on, but like, I don't know if you notice your action heroes or your action figure said environmental hero. I didn't tell it to do that, you know, so the robot overlords think you're an environmental hero. Anyways, the Post Oak Savannah has a maximum allowable permitted production of 2 acre foot per acre per year. But they also in their rules say if everyone uses their right to produce their non-exempt groundwater, it ends up with the correlative right of the mag divided by the acreage. Once pumping exceeds the modeled available groundwater number, the existing producers that are above the correlative right take a haircut to make room. So this is an approach that allows current pumpers to use more than a pure correlative right amount on a temporary basis until everyone else decides to use their right. And then also an interesting thing is because they have this thing defined, they have an aquifer conservancy program. So people can get $5 to $25 per acre per year, depending on the term of agreement, to basically promise not to produce their groundwater. So challenges and opportunities. And I'm not picking on Bandera County River Authority and Groundwater District. They're essentially a random district I plucked out, not quite random, because I purposely chose one in the hill country because there are challenges with managing groundwater in the hill country. You know, the aquifer is not as productive. And then also I was looking for a district where it was completely underlain by the aquifer, so I didn't have to figure out any areas, make adjustments on the area of the aquifer underneath the district. Also, I looked for a single county district so then I could just find the area of the county. So that's why they are here. So they have a production limit. Oh, and they also had to have a correlative allocation. So they have a production limit of 1 acre foot per acre per year. And the area of the county is 791 square miles, which results in a maximum annual production of 506,240 acre feet per year. In other words, there's 506,240 acres in that county. And if everybody can produce 1 acre foot per year per acre of non-exempt use, It's over 500,000 acre-feet per year. The modeled available groundwater, what you can pump to achieve the desired feature condition, 9,293 acre-feet per year. So there is generally this disconnect between what rules allow versus what the managed available groundwater might suggest. Now, of course, not everybody is pumping the full amount of groundwater they can produce underneath their property. But as more and more people do, then you get some pressure against the desired feature condition in the model available groundwater. And this is when a district basically has to decide, well, what are we going to do? The people haven't pumped yet. They have a fair share according to the Texas Supreme Court. But if we shut off all the permits, we're going to get sued because we took away their groundwater rights. And becomes easier to just move the goalposts, make the desired feature condition more permissive. If you take that model available groundwater and divide it by 791 square miles as acres, that results in a correlative allocation of 0.18 acre-feet per year per acre, which is about 0.011 gallons per minute. I think I can spit faster than that. So this is a challenge for districts to implement, and particularly for districts where the aquifers aren't terribly productive. So that's something to consider. Another issue pops up is, can you correlate in karst? And a lot of my hydrogeological friends are like, nope, you can't do that. But I beg to disagree. First off, it's well, actually maybe all off. It's districts do it. The Edwards Aquifer Authority's original allocation for irrigated users was 2 acre-feet per acre of irrigated agriculture on the San Antonio segment of the Edwards Aquifer. And yes, that was forced by the Texas legislature, but it seems to have worked quite well. And there's a number of groundwater districts that use correlative allocations in limestone aquifers already. I think one concern, one issue is that, well, some places you can get a lot more water than, say, another place. But the permeability in the subsurface, or fractures or caves in the subsurface, almost act like extended or horizontal wells. And so does that allow a user to pull water underneath your property? Or do they have a correlative allocation tied to them being in a jointly shared reservoir of water? I would argue the latter. And again, there's nothing to stop that from happening. I think part of the concern about using correlative allocations in a karst limestone setting is like looking at what Guadalupe County did, which is looking at sand thickness. It's like you could try to correlate to something, maybe aquifer thickness, but there's not a requirement. In fact, it's rare for districts, in Texas or even elsewhere in the country, to add a hydrogeologic factor in there. So on the opportunity side, you can set a cap if you use a correlative allocation approach. And when you set a cap on how much can be produced, it creates a market. You see that with the Edwards Aquifer. I'm told that that's the case in the Guadalupe Groundwater Conservation District. That's certainly the case in the Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation District. When there's no cap, then anybody can come in for a permit. It offers opportunities for conservation. So that example from the Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation District, where they have a program for people to not produce water from their property, and they get paid for conserving that water. Any other district that has this, if there's land conservancy programs, then when they purchase land or purchase development rights on land, they would then also be conserving water. Provides a fair share. Again, districts are in this trap of rule of capture with speed bumps. if you're able to figure out a way to do correlative rights approach, you've guaranteed everybody a fair share. So if you go to court, jumping to that last bullet there, you know, you may be able to defend yourself better because you've come up with an approach to give everybody a fair share of the resource. And then also in the examples I've shown you, you can actually achieve the desired future conditions if you do a coupled correlative approach. So put the slide up here. This is kind of my little dummy slide. I really don't have time to go into it, but the report, which I put a link in the chat, has an example of Yipeng and I looking at the Leon Belding production zone in outside of Fort Stockton, in terms of like, what would that look like to move to a correlative rights approach? And that's a case there where, you know, we went in with, we don't want to cut anybody's permits back. And so how do we build in, this is a karst system where we did look at the hydrogeology, build in the hydrogeology and, you know, maybe facilitate the district, if it wanted to go to a correlative rights allocation. I think there's benefits there for everyone involved, because right now folks can walk in and get permits. You know, the district does manage that system towards sustainable use, but there's also, you know, there's stressors on certain permit categories that would go away with a cap on production, and then furthermore allow folks to, you know, buy and dry permits to benefit the resilience of their own permits, or buy and dry permits to you know, bring back for conservation measures, say for example, to bring back Comanche Springs, which is what this image is here, from one of my favorite postcards that shows the springs way back in the day before there was a formal swimming pool. So with that, hopefully I've given you a reason to think about, like, why would I want to do correlative rights? I think there's a number of reasons why. Hopefully you have a better sense of what a correlative right is and what I mean by correlative allocation. Giving you some examples of, you know, like this is used pretty commonly already in Texas. So it's you know, just the function of do you want to use it and to achieve what goals, and giving you some examples of kind of creative ways districts have brought in other considerations. Brought in the concept of coupled and uncoupled correlative allocations. So, you know, if one of the goals is to achieve desired future conditions, then, you know, this is a way to do that. And you know, looking at what districts have done, I'm not saying it's legal, you know, until it goes to court, you don't know, but you know, here's some things that districts have done to kind of deal with the legacy of the past way they've dealt with stuff. To accommodate that, while at the same time switch into correlative allocation going forward in the future, to, you know, not only kind of protect historic uses, but then also protect private property rights going forward through a fair share approach. And then some of the challenges and opportunities that are there. There's certainly challenges here when you take, you know, a model available groundwater number. Some aquifers it's easier to do than others. Take it and divide it out by the acreage. But there's also a lot of potential elements on the plus side. And then I didn't put a bullet up here, but if you want to like live underneath the radar, go talk to Gary Westbrook, because somehow the computer machines don't know who he is or who he works for. And you know, that may be useful to you. So at this point, happy to take any questions. You're welcome to put it into the chat. And I see I got a couple questions in the chat. On slide 23, do you mean correlation or allocation? Oh man, which slide 23? Thanks for being here, Bill. Let's see. Yeah, it should be allocations. Well, actually, I put in correlations. I was trying to be alliterative, considerations for correlations. correlative allocations. But yes. Doug Weirman, our district's dealing with stacked aquifer systems and correlative allocations. And that's a good question. On the Guadalupe, Guadalupe County Groundwater Conservation District, they're using a correlative allocation approach on the Carrizo, but they're looking to do something different with the Wilcox part of the aquifer. And they're using coupled correlative allocations in the Carrizo, and I think they're still going to probably do correlative allocations on the Wilcox, but it's not coupled. That's my understanding. And then Barton Springs has, I guess it's not correlative allocations. They have historic use with the possibility of interruptible permits for the Edwards, but last I checked in with them, they're kind of looking at doing something a little different with the Trinity that's underneath. Any other questions? I'm not sure if I'm gonna be able to see people raise hands or not. Maybe Patty can see that. Oh, I got 2 new messages here. I need to click on that button. Well, maybe not. No, those are the same ones.
I don't see any raised hands.
Okay.
Robert, this is Kimberly. I have a quick question if I could jump in.
Go.
Yeah.
Sure.
And this actually might relate to that last slide 23 that we were just on. But how would you incorporate considerations for different rates of recharge and different, I guess, kind of demands or the less efficient use of water with climate change? So for example, if that water is being pulled up and used for irrigation and we have a much hotter and warmer climate and we have higher evapotranspiration, is there a concern that there will be a need for using more water, which could then stress the aquifer supplies further? So as we look towards challenges with uncertainty and climate change, should there be, would you recommend some sort of progressive decrease in the amount of water used over time, or some way to try to account for what might be increased uses because of just how that amount of water may not provide the same meet the same needs that it does currently? Does that make sense?
Yep, that makes sense. So I heard 2 questions. First one, kind of related to, well, I guess maybe they're related, although I kind of heard maybe something else. So I'll use that as an excuse to talk about something else. But like in a dipping aquifer, and I'm thinking more sandstone like Carrizo, Wilcox, or Gulf Coast. You've got a recharge zone, and then you've got this unconfined zone, and then this confined zone. In terms of building in like recharging a system like that for into an aquifer system like that, I'm not sure that's important, but it may be that correlative allocations are made based on depth to the aquifer, because a lot of these dipping confined aquifers, their value as a resource comes from artesian pressure head. And so artesian pressure above the top of the aquifer. And so that could be built in. That's something years ago I advised state of Virginia to do with their Gulf Coast aquifer. And then you have a different value for the outcrop zone. On your question on kind of recharge, maybe in a more responsive system, say like the Edwards aquifer, you you definitely could do that. You know, in a way, like the Edwards Aquifer Authority does things, say, with the farmers that have a correlative allocation. You know, during droughts, they reduce the percentage of how much they can use. And of course, that's, you know, that can be changed, as you're aware of, through the habitat conservation plan. So districts that are in, you know, really responsive aquifers can build in a adaptive approach to account for, you know, changes in recharge, you know, regardless of what the cause of that is. Or, you know, like on the increased use side, it's you know, it's more about like, what is that permitted amount that they can use, and you know, how does that fit into what the long-term goals are.
Right. Okay.
So Ron Green said Uvalde sums all aquifers, so the total is not exceed 2.5 acre feet per acre. I'm assuming you mean that Uvalde Groundwater Conservation District. Let's see, did you find any interesting approaches to quantify and understand the exempt uses in the 59 districts with correlative allocations? So thanks for that question, Trey. There's a, in the report, and I didn't talk about in the presentation, but in the report, we did take a look at exempt uses and how districts handle exempt uses. You know, there is, you know, some newer, I mean, they weren't there when I first started working in water, so take that into account, but newer requirements on like districts, like if you have at least 10 acres, it's kind of the vanilla thing in the water code, I believe. If you have at least 10 acres, then district can't tell you what to do with your exempt use. But if you're less than 10 acres, you know, a district could. And so the report talks about how districts have modified that. You know, in some cases, they've actually increased it from 10 to 20. In other cases, districts have lowered that. One innovative thing was here, the Hayes County Commissioner's Court has I'm probably going to get the details wrong here, but has something like a 10 acres. Like if you have at least 10 acres, knock yourself out with your exempt well. But if you want to be less than 10 acres, then you know, you need to like do, like, you can get lots less than 10 acres if you're doing rainwater harvesting. And that may only apply to the western part of the county, but that's a creative thing that's being done. It's also interesting, like with these Trinity, Hill Country counties and groundwater districts, it's like what can be pumped through exempt use is pretty massive compared to the modeled available groundwater number. So it isn't just permitted supplies are a challenge, but also the exempt uses as well. So I see we're at 3:30. I don't see any other questions. You are welcome to reach out to me oh man, keep doing that. Welcome to reach out to me. Here's my contact info. If you have any further questions or you want a copy of that Gary Westbrook action figure, please don't hesitate to reach out. This presentation was recorded, and so we'll go ahead and post it. So if any of your friends missed it and didn't catch the change in the link, we'll post that for folks to watch. Thank you again for your attention, and appreciate the kind words.